Today we have the honor and pleasure of having Professor Craig Gibson be our guest, daughter of mine. And the occasion for this is, of course, the introduction of this new framework for informational literacy for higher education from ACRL. And Professor Gibson has been involved with the ACRL since '97, I believe, or quite a long time in various capacities. In various capacities. And we are very fortunate that he was one of the co-chairs of the ACRL Informational Literacy Standards Task for Higher Education Task Force that came up with the new framework. I know Professor Gibson. I was fortunate enough to go to the immersion program, ACRL Immersion in 2012 at Champlain College in Burlington, and he was one of the professors there. Hence, I was thinking, wouldn't that be a wonderful opportunity, since we are actually living in the same town, to invite him up to have a talk, a rather informal talk like this one is, with librarians and other stakeholders, people who work in the Library Center for Teaching and Learning, about the implications of the introduction of the framework for us in terms of instruction. What do we need to change? And this has been a question for us. Do we need to change anything? If we need to change anything, what do we need to change? Do we need to forget anything? Do we need to unlearn something? So maybe some of these things will be addressed today. So I would like to hand things over to you, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you, and thanks all of you for being here. I'm really glad to be here. This is going to be really informal, small group. I will talk, but please feel free to stop me if you have questions. We'll have some really good conversation at the end about the framework. I've talked to multiple groups about this, and there's some common themes that come up all the time, and then there are institution-specific issues that come up frequently. So I think one of the observations I would make about this is this framework. We started out thinking about it a certain way, the task force that I co-chaired, and it evolved, and it kind of became what I call a crowdsourced document, because we had the whole profession involved in creating it. We got a lot of feedback as we developed it. So I think that's been really positive and productive. And there's still a lot of discussion ongoing about it. Actually, there's a listserv out there that you can sign up for, and there are lots of people who are blogging about it. So I think what I want to start with, first of all, is let's talk about the student's experience of research, this forbidding word, research. If you could describe students' research skills, the students that you see all the time, in one phrase or one sentence, how would you describe it? Those skills.
One word.
One. Pardon?
Google.
Google. Yeah. What else?
Virgin.
Yeah. Anything else?
I think they know more than they really do.
They think they know more than they really do. Yes. Yeah. They're somewhat overconfident. Yes.
What topic is easiest to find information about?
Yeah. What? They don't challenge
It's a means to an end, not
Yeah. I'm thinking of a mismatch often between skills and expectations.
On the part of the students themselves or faculty who give us assignments?
Yes, between faculty and students, and the skills that they have are somehow, it's not that they're missing, but they're in a way mismatched to what is expected from them in terms of performing well.
So assumptions are made about skills that they may have that they're not really prepared to have. There's been a fair amount of research, and you may be aware of the Project Informational Literacy's national study. There have been various studies done. Actually, OSU, Ohio State's participated in it as well. And some of the primary findings as presented by Allison Head in a paper at an ACRL conference a couple of years ago Students are just really overwhelmed a lot of times. They don't know about good starting points. They don't understand academic research assignments when they come in from high school. They don't understand the expectations again. They're often confused about how open-ended the process can be, and when faculty send them to the library to find information, they don't know when to stop. It's just this open-ended, amorphous nature, and they don't know how to define boundaries. And of course, you mentioned Google and Wikipedia, and the other favorite resources are their favorite database. They learn one resource and they go to it repeatedly. What they come to college with from high school, the research paper is a particular genre, and it's been overworked. There are other kinds of assignments that faculty can give that would engage different parts of the research process. So yes, they're carrying into college many of the routines and practices they found. There have been other findings from other research studies. Some of these, somebody mentioned overconfidence. Discovery is not usually a problem. It's really context. They don't understand the context for what they're finding or seeing. And of course, they start with Google. These reports right here come from another set of findings that is reported or summarized in American libraries. What's does the library offer versus what's on the open web? And they're satisficing, finding a few things, and then even the habit of using other people, perhaps in an uninformed way, rather than librarians. And there have been a lot of studies that show that students will go to somebody else rather than going to us or going to a librarian. So the big issue, I think, from the Project Information Literacy findings again is the context. They don't get the big picture. They don't understand how to start. They don't understand the whole process of information gathering. They don't know language well enough to know how to put search terms together in an informed way. And then the expectations of assignments themselves are a challenge for them. So this is all kind of all of these findings kind of figured into our thinking as a task force about what we need to do going forward, because we've had these standards, and a lot of you are familiar with information literacy standards, which are a long list, forbidding list, fairly forbidding. And we were trying to think a little bit more holistically about what might be really helpful or useful. So this is how I would visually show it. What we're trying to do is to get from what's on the left there, this linear way of thinking about research, to a more holistic network of understandings. And so what we have with the framework doesn't, well, it more or less does translate to what you see on the right, knowing about scholarship, knowing about authority, how information gets created, the process of searching itself, and inquiry, the process of question formulation, all of these fitting together, as opposed to the linear process of the standards on the left, which involves just define this information need and find the information, evaluate it, use it, and apply it, boom, 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 boom. Whereas we know that writing and thinking are iterative and circular, and if there's often a back and forth, that's the way that our minds work. So the task force really wanted to move toward this more holistic model. We wanted to focus on the landscape or the ecosystem of information itself, rather than specific sources. We wanted the students to start understanding how the pieces fit together and help them understand why they're doing what they're doing, rather than just procedural stuff. Knowing how to press a button, knowing how to formulate a search strategy one time. We wanted to get beyond particular skills and resources and really get students to understand that there are human beings who write articles and books and create knowledge, that knowledge creation happens through human activity. Those books that end up on the library shelves are there because there are people at some point who created them, and there are whole sets of processes that go into that. So trying to get them to understand that. So if I were representing this idea of the ecosystem, again, this would be a very rough depiction of what it might look like, but all of these, we use these terms with students, and for them, these are often disconnected and they don't know how they all fit together. So what we wanted to do is just start developing a framework that would help them, to get them to understand how peer review works in terms of scholarly practices and publishers and copyright, and what might be the role of community organizations as an information resource, for example, and how search engines have limitations, what are the role of repositories, what are open access, this whole set of ideas and practices that are out there in our field. We need to put those together in a pedagogically appropriate way and start scaffolding student understanding of those. So it was this, we really depended on the idea of meta-literacy as well, and you may have heard that term. The other co-chair of the task force, Trudy Jacobson, has worked on this idea of meta-literacy for a while. And this really emphasizes the participatory, collaborative nature of learning, and not just the individual student. The students are creators. And we wanted to bring in that idea of the student as creator rather than the student as passive consumer. So that's an underpinning of meta-literacy, metacognition, the ability to think and improve on one's thinking. Very important. And also the standards that you may be familiar with, if you read through those, there's critical thinking aspects, components of those all the way through, but we really saw a gap with the attitudinal or the affective aspect of learning and how important that really is. So we wanted to build that into the framework. This is a pretty tall order to try to bring all of these elements together in one document. And well, we did it, and people are still discussing all of these and exploring the implications. So the major elements of the framework are the threshold concepts, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and what we called knowledge practices, and then what we call dispositions. Threshold concepts are draw on a pedagogical research tradition coming out of the UK. And these are really considered conceptual understandings or gateways to understanding a discipline. And various disciplines have identified some of those for their own fields. And then supporting these are knowledge practices and dispositions. Knowledge practices are actually behaviors that demonstrate that the student understands the concept, and dispositions are more like attitudes or habits of mind. Threshold concepts I want to talk about just a little bit and pick your brain about what you think they might be and fields that you might work with or know about. What do you think a threshold concept in, say, geology might be? I'm asking that. I took geology as an undergraduate when I was a freshman. What might be something really, really challenging? Threshold concepts are really difficult or counterintuitive, challenging concepts that are not immediately obvious. And the idea is that you have to cross the threshold, work your way through the portal. Or any other field that you're familiar with. We can talk about geology. For me, I think the threshold concept that would be most obvious for me would be the scale of geologic time. Just the immensity of geology, what's the age of the earth. That's very hard to grasp. Yeah. But once you grasp that, then a lot of other things in that field begin to make sense. if you can get that and understand that, then you really begin to understand the other parts of that terrain and that field. So before we move on a lot further, are there any other fields that you're familiar with? What might be a threshold concept in history?
Knowledge of which are the main or important journals.
Pardon?
The important journals.
Well, but in terms of something that students just when they're taking history, a basic survey course in history.
Context.
A faculty member is working, and particularly this is a problem in survey courses because students are just, typically regurgitating facts or learning just a lot of factual material.
Just context, like when things have happened, like a timeline, contextual stuff.
Yes.
I'm thinking about art history and how when you look at something and maybe what's coming out at a certain time, it's the politics. It's so much more beyond that is influencing those works.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right, and perhaps even the idea of contingency. Students can learn in history that there's this idea of contingency that affects how things happen, or that another one in history that I would think of is sort of like there's no one account of the past that explains everything. Students learn that there's one explanation for an historical event where actually there are multiple actors and multiple perspectives.
Biases.
Right, so it's kind of hard to get that.
And this, for instance, another example would be style or prosody when you're interpreting poetry or a literary text. It's to know what to be looking for when you see something. What am I looking for when I'm looking at this poem? What it is that I'm looking for when I'm reading this short story. And in a way that it would be an example of once you understand that that is something that could be encountered over and over again in different contexts, then you can apply it again and again and again. But, and this is where one of the questions that in a way anticipate, the occasion anticipates the question. We tend to think of this as being somehow themselves outside of the interpretation itself, but they themselves are constructed in a different context. So the frames are themselves within an even larger frame, and we are constantly shifting frames, even when we use them for a particular context, because we're using this frame for interpretation in a particular time, but then you're shifting when you're using different frames. And in this sense, I think in a way our very own discussion here brings us to a new framework of understanding informational literacy, precisely because we use different lenses.
Yes, and we can think of these as lenses, or we can think of them as windows. There are various metaphors, but I've just tried to represent here again that we were thinking of the frames being composed of these three parts. The underpinning ideas, the behaviors, and the habits of mind all fitting together to form the frames. So this is a more integrative way of thinking about learning as a whole person, engaging the mind, engaging the emotions, engaging ideas, and being willing to, to learn threshold concepts in a particular field is to learn how to think like an expert in that field. To move from novice to expert, and there's often a big change in the whole person. The question has come up whenever we've had these conversations, well, we're not really trying to make students into little librarians, are we? No, we're not trying to make students into little librarians. That's been one of those red herrings for many years whenever we try to teach more conceptually. However, I do think we want to address what's really needed for students to learn how to work in this landscape, this complicated landscape, and not be naive students in the 21st century. So threshold concepts, I've already talked a little bit about this. They really grew out of the research in the UK with Meyer and Land and their work in economics. And in the library field, there's some librarians who started working with the idea of threshold concepts, and we drew on their research. They did a Delphi study, and I've mentioned their names here, and that study is ongoing. So one of the members of the Delphi study group, Lori Townsend, was a member of our task force as well. So her work has informed what the task force did. So there's my little, in a nutshell, I've given you a preview already. It's like, these are rites of passage in anthropological terms, or these are gateways. And I think the key part of the theory here is that students are challenged by them, and they have to move through what we call this difficult space, this liminal space that might be a little disruptive for them or disturbing for them. It's going to be a challenge for them. So that's the way I would represent what the liminal state, how it works. You're a novice, and you go through a lot of confusion or anxiety or uncertainty and dealing with any difficult ideas or counterintuitive ideas or new vocabulary, unfamiliar ways of thinking. And once you get through that, then you're able to integrate knowledge in that area and in a better way, put it together. Everything begins to make sense. So there's a shift in perspective. So they talked about these characteristics of threshold concepts, that they transform the learner, they enable the learner to integrate knowledge. Threshold concepts are irreversible. Once you get it, you don't go back to an earlier level of understanding. And they're bounded. They separate off a discipline from, say, a related discipline. And they're troublesome. They're often difficult. They're not easy to learn. And here are some of the ones. I've already talked about geology, but you're familiar with some of these fields. Economics. Anytime anybody's taking an economics course, economists would say you have to understand opportunity cost.
That was what I was trying to think of.
Yeah,
opportunity
cost, to understand a lot of other aspects of that discipline. If you don't understand that, you're going to have trouble understanding the discipline of economics.
So there's no reason that they might have picked that up before college.
Pardon?
I mean, the threshold concept of each discipline may have been picked up before college.
Yes, yes.
There's nothing that says it has to be.
This is just a partial list. There's been a lot of research in different disciplines. There's a website actually in the UK that publishes ongoing research about threshold concepts. So there's a lot of investigation and talk among faculty about what they are. Writing, the ideas of audience or voice. Students who are just learning to write have to learn those.
I was just going to say, do you have any good examples to share for information literacy? Like a concept that a librarian would need to grasp? I'm just trying to think of one, and I wonder if you have any off the top of your head.
Well, information science or information.
Yeah.
I mean, the threshold, what we're doing with the framework are what we think are the ones we use to teach. And so these are the ones we need to grasp as well in order to, I hope does that make sense?
Yeah,
we have to understand these in order to teach more effectively. Mm-hmm. So
our threshold concept is threshold concepts?
They're probably we've joked quite a bit. A threshold concept is that idea itself is a threshold concept. Yeah. It takes a little while to grasp really what it is. Well, let's just talk about that a little bit, though. In the information, when you were going to library school, those of you who went to library school, what was this particularly challenging?
Website design.
Website design.
More of conceptually metadata, for instance.
Metadata, and different types of metadata.
Yes.
There are multiple
and
types of metadata.
The very idea of data about data.
Data about data. That's not easy to grasp.
I would also say the classification systems.
Yeah.
Classification systems.
I think was.
Yeah. That too.
So we may have some of these. I mean, we're expecting students to learn various aspects of those. We're not expecting them to be experts. in those areas. However, that if students are learning to create objects and to assign, and they're putting them in a repository, then they have to learn something about metadata themselves, right? So it's that, again, a lot of these ideas connect with each other. I think I could give you the URL for the website at the end. I don't have it here for the bibliography of the ongoing research about threshold concepts. If you just want to see the full range of ideas, threshold concepts in different disciplines, these are just a few. Biologists would say that photosynthesis is a threshold concept. If you don't get that, you're not going to understand other aspects of that discipline. So, for information literacy, and drawing on the Delphi study, these are the 6 that we identified, and we had a lot of debate and discussion about what they should be called, how to describe them, even how to name them. Even how to name them. Really, really kind of a challenge. And what the task force did was not exactly congruent with the Delphi study group, but it's very similar. So I think I would say one point we realized fairly early on that these interrelate. They interconnect. They're not totally distinct. There's a web of these touch each other. They actually if students can understand something about scholarship as a conversation, that scholars influence each other over time, and that pieces of research are connected in a web, they're also going to know how to know about authority and how to contextualize particular pieces of research. And they're also going to know, as a result of that investigation, how to frame a good research question that they could continue to refine over time, rather than just starting with a question and then assuming there's nothing available on it. So the intersections among these, I think the more you think about them, the more you'll understand that they do relate. I'm not going to read this. This is just the text of the one bar authority is constructed and contextual. Whenever we thought about authority in the past, this is the one that relates to evaluating a source. What do we do right now in teaching students how to evaluate a source? What do you do here when you teach students how to evaluate a source? How do you teach them to do that?
Well, we use some of the literature existing out there, the CRAB test, for
the CRAB
test, some other similarly phrased criteria, and we try to teach them in a particular context, looking at specific contexts. For instance, websites, articles. Now a lot of the tools that we have here do a lot of the work for them.
Right.
So when you're trying to do the CRAB text with the results obtained through the discovery layer, there isn't much you can do there, because that has been already kind of pre-selected for them. Right. And in a way that kind of kills the critical spirit. And this is one of the paradoxes. We're trying to help them at the same time to kill their inquisitiveness, because we already provide them with reviewed material and peer-reviewed material. So we try to...
So I think one of the challenge, a lot of the pitfalls in using that test, and a lot of librarians use it. I mean, I've used something similar to that myself, is that students can get the idea that this is a checklist. If they can work their way through it, they're really going to, that's all they need to know. And it becomes kind of a reductive, it can become kind of a reductive approach to, whereas if they learn this more nuanced approach to thinking about authority, different sources can be authoritative in different contexts depending on the assignment. A blog can be perfectly authoritative, or a video on YouTube can be perfectly authoritative for certain types of uses. And we sometimes put this holy aura around peer review as well in academia. And we know that scholars and researchers are human beings and they have flaws. And students need to learn that peer review needs to be examined in a more critical spirit as well.
Yeah, it's true. I agree. The problem is that often faculty fetishize the
Yes,
idea of
I
peer
know,
reviewing,
I know.
and they transmit that onto their students.
Yeah.
And their students come and say, "Oh, my professor wants me to find 5 peer-reviewed
Five
articles."
peer,
But why?
I need articles from 3 peer-reviewed
Yes.
journals.
Exactly.
Well, this opens up an opportunity for a conversation between a librarian and a faculty member about designing that assignment in a different way,
Yeah.
perhaps. So, with this particular frame of authority, we would suggest knowledge practices, defining different types of authority. You know, there's different ways of thinking about it: societal position, public office, special experience, as well as subject or disciplinary expertise, and knowing how to use research indicators and indicators of authority, determine credibility, and then the fact that scholars can be challenged and they challenge each other. We know that's true. They don't. Scholars who write in peer-reviewed journals do not have all of the truth. And students sometimes assume that they do. So there are dispositions that go along with these as well, and this really has to do with the attitudinal or the affective domain as well. Having the open mind, motivation, affective aspects, being willing to do this, making the effort to do this, knowing that it's effortful to learn in this way, that's really important. So, of course, the question is coming up a lot, well, how do you measure this? And that's measuring, getting at the attitudinal aspect is something that we're working on. So I think a lot of you probably heard of another model, which I'll just back up, called Understanding by Design. We could say McTeague. And that really has to do with focusing on the core or enduring understandings. When you're thinking about designing a course and working out, looking in the middle there, that circle in the middle, and knowing what's really most important and start designing curricular or assignments around that, as opposed to things that are important to know or do or worth being familiar with. And so there's this backward design model. What do you want the students to know and be able to do rather than throwing a lot of content at them? It's a way of winnowing content. So this is a somewhat analogous model when thinking about using threshold concepts. So what's the potential of the framework? We're still exploring the potential of the framework. There's all kinds of experimentation going on out there right now. I think one obvious point to me is that it involves conversations among all of these parties. Students are often left out. Faculty design assignments, librarians may work, librarians are really being proactive, having those conversations about assignment design. But I think drawing students into the process and thinking about getting them to help inform what we do, what we are designing with them, and in a way almost co-creating some of what we do, because we want to form a community of learning here. So I think curriculum redesign involves all of the parties. Glenys Cousin, another one of the people in the threshold concepts movement in the UK, uses a term called transactional curriculum inquiry, and she suggests these are guidelines to look for areas of overloaded content. This is a familiar challenge. We have too much content to teach. Look for bottlenecks to understanding. What do the students always have problems with year after year? Bottlenecks to understanding. And talk to the students about what they need to master, or what things that are causing misunderstandings for them. Barbara Pfister, who's in the library field, has also suggested we actually want students to stay in that zone of uncertainty for a little while to be sure that the learning actually happens. We don't want them to fake it. We want them to be challenged enough. I would suggest also that designing with your colleagues, working with faculty, trying to think about these 6 frames strategically across the curriculum, And if you have learning outcomes for your program already, realigning them. You may not need to toss them out. You may need just to think about them and see if you can redesign them or reword them. Building in learning activities or lessons around threshold concepts rather than something smaller, allowing for confusion and uncertainty, revisiting the concept more than once, and revising the learning outcomes if you need to. I just presented here a model. This is very abstract and very general in thinking about how this might work. If you were working with one of the frames, such as scholarship as a conversation, how would you address it if you had freshman inquiry courses or some course analogous to that at your institution? Then if you had research methods courses or writing intensive courses, how would you address that at a more advanced level? And if you had synthesis or capstone courses, how would you address it at that level? So you need to think about what it would mean for freshmen, first-year students, I should use that term now, first-year students to think about scholarship as a conversation. What would it mean to design an assignment or a series of assignments to address that for first-year students? We often think that students can't learn that, until they get into subject major courses or more advanced courses, some of these more, but I would like to challenge us to think about teaching first-year students some of these ideas. So curricular positioning at different levels, or even co-curricular positioning. There are many institutions that have other opportunities for learning outside the formal classroom setting, service learning opportunities, engagement in the community. How could we start relating those learning opportunities to these ideas? Our field experience, internships. Information literacy should not be bound by the classroom. Students need to learn that being information literate means confident and conversant with information in the world. That there's a larger stage, there's a larger arena in which they will be operating. Once they get into the work world, they're going to have to be proficient in some way and knowing how to use information resources and think about research. Many professions, many occupations require that. So I think a good way of getting them ready to that is to think about information literacy in these frames out there beyond the classroom itself. There's an article by Megan Oakleaf, thinking about assessment. This has been a question that's come up fairly often as we worked our way through this process. How do we think about assessment in the framework? And so I've given you the URL for that. You can easily find it as well. But she has some good suggestions for thinking about how to assess these and how to turn what we have in the framework into learning outcomes and using a rubric in a way that you can start evaluating what students are learning for these 6 frames. A lot of what needs to be done is what I call qualitative assessment, using portfolios, using journals, other methods, seeing what students are putting in course management systems and discussion boards, and to get snapshots of what their emerging understandings really are. And Megan does talk about those in her article. She also follows the precepts of the Understanding by Design model, which I mentioned a little while ago. Need to avoid assessments that just allow students to mimic superficial or shallow understanding, and they need to represent their knowledge in some of these methods. You can use some of this in class. You can do some of it outside of class. This would require coordination with faculty, some of whom may be using some of these methods already. So I'd encourage you to find out who's using them. So putting it all together, wrapping it up, what's happening now, I hope you'll be encouraging conversations here and with colleagues elsewhere about the framework, and having conversations here with faculty and students. find some people in the administration who are going to be supportive of this. And teaching and learning centers, really natural ally. Create a community of practice. And you don't have to use the jargon, threshold concepts. You know, we need to think about this as being a holistic set of understandings that students need to learn about research and information. And just being experimental as much as possible. ASERL has an effort right now. Sharon Mader is a visiting program officer that she's working on professional education for librarians and others, and she's speaking at conferences about the framework. And some of the ideas that have been, I think they're still emerging right now. She's working with another group to create a website and maybe a repository of examples, lesson plans, or other kinds of documents that would show what librarians and others are doing with the framework. So, I'll stop. I think we've had a pretty good conversation so far, but I want to stop and see what kinds of questions you have or what kind of discussion you'd like to have at this point. Yes?
Before the information literacy standard, there's some intention to translate into the discipline-specific standard.
Yes.
So how about the framework? Are there any intention to also translate it into the discipline-specific?
Yes, there are. Now, there are multiple, this is a library, and there are multiple sections of ASERL that have developed discipline-specific versions of the standards. So all of those sections are discussing those now. There's a women's studies section of ASERL that's already doing some work.
Mm-hmm.
So that work is in progress already.
Is there a website about that?
I think they all have their individual websites. There's not one website that brings all that together. That's a good question, though. I'll send Sharon, the person I mentioned earlier, an email about that and see if she's able to point to one place where all of that information is available. Because each of those sections, if you go and look, the information is kind of scattered right now about what they're doing.
Yeah, I think sometimes the biggest challenge is, I feel like, is that librarians we're talking our own language, and then in fact how you translate that language into their faculty language, and so they, to create more buy-ins. And otherwise you have those librarians and talking about information literacy here, and then the faculty think, oh, our students are good, they are pretty literate and they can find what they want. And so sometimes how you translate it into.
So what's a good opener in a conversation with faculty about information literacy? What's a good opening?
Better papers. Better papers, and we
better
can
papers.
help with better process, basically.
Go ahead.
No, I was thinking about what Jane said, and about the difficulty being most of the time the different jargon we're using and the different terminologies librarians and some faculty from different disciplines are using, and the fact that if you actually this institution has been through an accreditation visit last year, and in view of that has tried to really implement this set of goals and learning outcomes, and each department had to come up with a disciplinary language for those. And if you're looking at some of those, they are in a way considering that some of the skills that the students need to acquire would be very much compatible with our idea of what an information literacy threshold concept might be. So in a way, they are using already some of this threshold.
For instance, some of the underlying ideas.
Peer reviewing, yes, experimentation.
Right.
Some of these ideas already exist, and they're part of the vocabulary of the disciplines that they're using, and they're even actually measuring. And in a way, that is the answer to the question: where is the disciplinary version of the threshold concepts for information literacy? Some of them already exist. In a way, embedded or couched in a different language, in a different vocabulary. And in a way, I think that the big effort for us would be to step beyond the jargon, to step beyond language and look for the concepts, for understanding. And once you look at the department and say, oh, I see they're doing this, which is very much compatible with what we're looking for. Doesn't matter they call it something else. They're looking for those things.
Right. Well, one idea that came up in my conversations with a lot of different librarians as we work through this process is that these overarching big ideas are really interdisciplinary. Just kind of take, scholarship is a conversation that happens regardless. Research is it manifests itself in different ways. But the big overarching idea, the 6 big ideas they're all interdisciplinary. When you work your way down to the knowledge practices, or the learning outcomes, those might be somewhat different. But that, I'm just putting that out there to think about.
Well, I think, one of the several reasons I'm here, but I think these frameworks have been articulated in a way that they haven't in some disciplines, but that people in disciplines would really appreciate, because they're, if you look at this, there's nothing there that pretty much doesn't apply in any field. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it'd be interesting to see what departments are listing, when they're doing their program review and listing their outcomes, and especially the multi-literate ones, which are more clearly where there's overlap, but this touches on the other ones too, and see what language they're using. But I think one of the reasons we're going to be doing an event for faculty this fall is I think they would find this helpful, and not just in knowing what the library can do, but in helping them frame their own the outcomes they want to have, which then may have when they get specifics to the outcomes, be more disciplinary, but these concepts are big enough that...
I agree with this. Unfortunately, given that we had a deadline and we had an institutional mandate towards accreditation, everyone thought in terms of a goal, rather than in terms of a concept, or in terms of the big ideas. Yeah. So maybe now we can break that hard crust and move into, okay, now let's see why we can make some changes.
Yeah. I think there's all kinds of ways, I think this idea of forming a community of practice or doing whatever you can with faculty and librarians together, and is there a student group here that you could tap? What challenges them? Can you do a kind of action research, pedagogical research involving students as well, or get the cooperation of some faculty to do that, just to test out these concepts in courses? Can you do that? So,
do you have any, say, examples? I do, after listening to, first of all, thank you. I think this make it more clear, and I agree with everybody else. And somehow maybe it would be easier to translate this library language into the more of a language, because they are also looking for the same thing. But in terms of assessment and how you can collaborate with faculty, because they are assessing their part and the library also assessing how is there any practical examples how we can collaborate it and co-assess that learning outcomes then effectively?
So I think it will involve, if you were thinking about, it would totally depend on the course or the discipline, but creating a learning outcome with a faculty member who's wanting them to learn history. I'm going back to history now. What would, a learning outcome for scholarship is a conversation in history. If that could, a learning outcome there could be created that would align with the learning outcome relating to investigating different authors or their different perspectives. I think there's a way of creating a congruent or parallel learning outcome that's information literacy specific that would align with the faculty members' learning outcome. So it's going to require a bit of a syllabus review or just seeing an opportunity. If you get to
I agree with that, and that part I get it. But then when it comes to grading and then assessing, and because sometimes for those kind of these conceptual threshold, you almost say if they're creating a research paper, you almost have to go and read the research paper and also look at very detailed in the bibliography in order to get the idea of they actually get the concept or not. And that part is usually graded down by the faculty instead of the librarian.
By the librarian.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's our perennial challenge, is how to open up the assessment door to librarians as well. So I think that's going to require some experimentation with willing faculty members and some novel assessment methods. Can you get little snapshots of what the students are learning? Can the students keep a journal along with their formal, as they're working their way through the research paper to see if they're developing emerging understanding about what scholarship as a conversation is. And if the librarian could review that and use a simple checklist or a rubric to look at what they're doing over the course of a semester. You know what I mean? The vehicle for assessment itself would be a journal or some way of capturing formatively, formative assessment, what the emerging understanding is.
And then the biggest challenge for that is, like, say, I did collaborate with one faculty, and then say they have 20 students in there, and then they welcome the librarians to come in and co-grade it or something. And then if I have like 5 or 7, department, and then all the class faculty is inviting me, how am I going to grade all those students and participate?
That would be a good problem to have, but any...
Well, I think something you said made me think of another example that would be not that you would be co-grading necessarily, but for example, with the assessment in writing intensive. So the writing intensive committee isn't grading all the papers written in writing intensive courses, but we're having people submit, each year is a different question we're looking at, and then it's just the committee reviewing, so if one of the goals is that students learn that, there's this writing process and they do stages of revision, we're just then looking at, okay, do we have examples that students have done a paper and done a revision that the teacher then gave them feedback on and they got a better grade? We're not grading the papers. And so I could see there being something where if you could get some faculty you work with, you're not grading all their papers, but they have an outcome that connects to one you have, and then you can just be looking at, okay, so how did this happen in that class? I don't know if that works for what the library needs to do for your program assessment, but it seems to me a lot of that is going to be, because I also can't help but think, like when you're talking about history, so I don't know if you know Joby DeCoster, but the whole, that there are different, we don't have one source of information. It's what he's teaching his students. He understands threshold concepts, and they have to read different sources and try to figure out how do you make meaning out of that. So he probably has a great assignment that, if you're whoever's working with him, it's you, because I know he works very closely with you, that you could pull some of that to use as assessment of the work you're doing with it.
Yeah, I think that would make. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I've gotten assignments retroactively that I'll ask for them and they'll give them to me, and then I can go and it would have been nice to have been part of the process during, but even getting them after is helpful to some extent. Getting to see bibliographies or getting to see the process of how they wrote the paper. So I mean, I've had some success asking for things after.
Yeah, I think that's workable for one, but my concern is that all the faculty, in all classes, and we already have our part of a job, and how can you? But
I think some selectivity and sampling would be a good approach, though.
Because I don't think we can do it for every class.
No, you just be pretty selective. And okay, this year we're really going to work with these courses, and we're going to see what we can learn, what students are getting, and this is all very intentional, and the faculty member agrees in advance, and we get that, and then we report on it, and then it's visible to everybody. Here's what we know: the students are understanding this, and we know the students are not understanding this.
Well, in a way, I feel like this is in a way. Like the holy grail of higher education, trying to prove that your students are actually learning something. There was this book I remember, was it probably 2011, Academically Adrift, I think it was called. And for the same time broke the sobering information that over 50% of the students who go through undergraduate education do not learn anything. they come out knowing, in terms of what they know, pretty much the same things that they knew before. And the push towards assessment has been, can higher education prove that the students at our institution or at any other institution actually learn more than, you know, the 50% mark that was mentioned in that book. And in a way, we're trying to aim towards the same goal. And it's a really hard nut to crack, because it seems to be a lingering problem. It seems to be ongoing. It seems to be long-term. It seems to discourage you from thinking in terms of short-term reports. It encourages more thinking in terms of 4-year, 5-year assessment reports, looking at how these people are doing 10 years from now. There was at the faculty, a full faculty conference we had the other day, there was this interesting text that talked about assessment, how you should do that every 7 years with students, you know, call them 7 years after they graduate, see how they feel. And that's another challenge of this. If we think in terms of large concepts of lifelong learning, of this, you know, qualitative changes in the way people understand information and understand the world, maybe we should look in that direction.
Yeah. Big challenge.
Yes.
A really big challenge.
Can I change gears just a little
Sure.
bit? That liminal state.
Yeah, the liminal state.
Did the task force write much, and/or could you recommend any resources in getting students through that? Because that scares me, because I can see, especially when we're doing an hour session with them, and that it's going to have to emphasize that we have to do it over the course of years, that they're coming into the classroom with us, hopefully. But I'm just curious if there was any talk or any resources you could recommend that would talk about helping them through that liminal state.
This is all about the affect, the fear, and the uncertainty.
Yeah.
In relation to, well, I'll have to think about this. Relation to threshold concepts in particular, I think that that website that I mentioned, I know it. I've seen sources on there about the liminal state.
Okay.
So I'm going to send you that URL for that, and you can share with everybody.
Yeah, this was always shared through the guide for
you can go and look. I mean, it's.
You can all go there.
And I'll do a little digging myself, and if I turn up anything specifically on addressing the liminal state specifically,
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'll let you know. Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I mean, so what are the indicators to you whenever you work with students that they're in a liminal state? How do they behave? Or how do they?
They like being in the liminal state.
Yeah, I would say I think sometimes it can either be frustration or just wanting to give up, or wanting to just get a good enough answer.
The easiest, the first thing that comes up, and just use it.
And what tells you that they passed through it and that they understand?
When they start going into the zone more, thinking about their topic creatively, and just getting into thinking about research.
Yes. There's research in our field, in the library science field, Carol Kuhlthau's research about that affective aspect of learning. If the students struggle in the early stages before they have a research question defined, and they fumble around a lot, and once that focus comes in view, then they begin to make progress. And that is one of the things that I come back to again and again and again, is knowing how to formulate a question. That is one of the...
Yeah, formulating a research question is almost a threshold concept.
That in itself, but it really is, if you go and look at the one for research inquiry, that really is the heart of it, is knowing how to formulate a really good research question and the ability to refine it or change it as a result of some preliminary investigation or more investigation. What I'm looking at doesn't prove or it'll support my initial research question at all. I have to change it. So
I think this, in a way, opens up so many possibilities for, rethinking not only library assignments, for instance, stuff that we work with students on, but also the way in which I'm thinking in general undergraduate research is supposed
undergraduate research, yes,
to work, in the sense, and we would like to see more open-ended research. Unfortunately, a lot of times research is very specific, and that's this paradox of we would like to create students who are lifelong learners and independent learners, but at the same time we would like to micromanage every single step that they go through. Yeah, and we would like them first to have a research question. We like them to have an outline. We like them to have and we're always, because and out of good intentions, I'm absolutely certain of this, we are sometimes undermining ourselves. And this is why I'm saying this example of the student who comes says, I have to find 5 peer-reviewed articles. Why? Often they don't know it is required. It is part of the
they don't understand the why.
Micromanagement.
They don't understand why. What's the reason for this?
Right.
This seems very artificial.
Yeah.
That I have to find 5. 5's a magic number.
Yeah, and maybe encouraging somehow faculty to, although that is going to be another very hard thing to do, to go to, and I don't know, maybe Catherine can talk a lot more to this idea of the open-ended assignment, where the students don't get panicked and they don't come and say, what do you want from me? Am I going to fail this class because I don't know exactly what you want from me? So
I don't have a solution for that and I wish I did. But I do think another way to connect with, on that faculty part of, the fact that you're using Wiggins and McTague, which we use for our course transformation institutes and other things, and I think if this is a way of helping them also frame some of those understandings for themselves, because I think there is an advantage to thinking about why sometimes they may not have it framed in quite the same way, because there is more of a focus then on the content that's attached to those processes. These frames are there, but they get hidden by the chemistry or whatever. Yes. And so the kind of removing them out the way they are here, where it can apply in all these different disciplines, may highlight that part that gets kind of buried. So when they say you need 5 peer-reviewed sources, but don't explain why and don't get into the nature of the research, it's because they're also then worried about, you need to be talking about quantum physics or whatever. And so this might be another way to help when we work with them. I mean, I could see bringing this in when we're working with people in course redesign, having them as they're thinking about defining those understandings and defining the assignments to bring in these frames.
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of things that can be done with course redesign or assignment redesign, if not courses, just working collaboratively on assignment redesign. And providing some good models and showing that these different models with different types of assignments addressing these concepts actually work. That's the assessment piece again. I certainly think it's a more interesting way to think about information literacy. It's more holistic, it's more integrated, it's not just skills-based. The debate has been for me, well, the students have to have skills. Well, yes, they have to have skills. But the thought process drives the skills. It's a way of thinking.
Can I also just say, I think one of these translations issues is just the phrase information literacy. For years, I just think faculty see it as something much smaller than what we're talking about here.
It's remedial or something.
And so I don't know if there's another way we can talk about it that it's not. Literacy makes it sound so basic, and information sounds so reductive to them that I think a lot of them would be surprised to really think of it in this way. And that seems to me just purely a language thing.
And I also like looking through the literature and looking through the process that the task force has been through, identifying the stumbling blocks, the difficult,
the bottlenecks,
the
understanding.
That gives us an idea about the local nature of the way in which the frameworks can be implemented. They should be in a way need-based, based on the needs of the students.
Talk to students, find out where they
struggle, and that has started us also thinking in terms of what we expect from the students, and rather than bring our own set of expectations, try to see what is actually happening out there in terms of curriculum, what kind of courses are being taught, and what are the the difficult spots.
It's true. We are all experts in this area, and we forget what novices know. And this is the whole idea of the way, the movement from novice to expert, or more expert-like thinking or ways of behaving. And how do we facilitate that? How do we make that movement happen? Get them over the threshold. Well, I think you've got some really good opportunities here. Moving forward, it's a small campus. You can have lots of conversations and make things happen. So I'm glad to know of your interest, and if I can help any more, I'll be.
What's OSU doing?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so
well,
how are you guys handling it?
Well, it's such a large, I've just been trying to get to talk to everybody in the libraries, just various library groups, first of all. I have talked to UCAT, and we've done we're doing little workshops here and there. I think we'll be doing some more, but we are also starting to talk about curriculum mapping and how to do that in relation to how do we actually do curriculum mapping at a big place like Ohio State relating to information literacy. So we have several things. How would we position information literacy learning outcomes in various sets of courses, create learning pathways? Yeah. So we're taking off little bits and pieces. So thank you for inviting me. If I can help in any other way, and I'll send you that URL, and if the limo set questions intriguing. It really is about the affective aspect for students. What are ways of addressing that, to help them.
Do we, just thinking about both students, but also the co-curricular stuff, do we connect with 5 cards?
Well,
you connect. Why am I calling myself we? Library. I'm saying because there's so many of them that naturally.
We experimented with the 5 cards last year, but it was a partially failed experiment. Precisely because I feel like there were so many people involved in this that at some point it wasn't clear who does what, where responsibilities start. And we had one student who was interested in doing this, and there were just too many people to be brought within the fold and made to agree upon what it is that we're expecting. This is definitely something that can be.
Because there's a research card, right?
There is a research
we had talked about it working
yes.
with the research card or with the internship card, because our students could be considered because
Right.
But I was thinking even not just of having a card for students, but with students who are getting those cards in other places. But if there's, I don't know if there's some way for that to be informed by this, like people who are doing other, like if other people, like if I'm sponsoring a student working on a research card, do I know about the frame?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a way to get that out through that system. I don't know that system a lot. Yeah.
Melissa Gilmore. Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, thank you
Nice
for
to see you
coming.
again.
Good to see you too, and glad I got a chance to come over.